Good morning. We're going to look at the book of John in the first chapter and see how the book tells us the balance between divinity and the humanity of Christ. John is one of the different books of the Bible, different from the synoptic Gospels of Matthew, Mark, and Luke. Most of what John says is not found in the other books. It tells a specific story about who Jesus is, the life of Jesus, and what he means on a higher spiritual level of the significance of Christ. Not just telling stories about what he did, but begin to reveal who he is in the human form and who he is in a divine form. We start off in the beginning in verse 1. It says, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God. All things came into being through him, and apart from him nothing came into being that has come into being. In him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness did not comprehend it." Some people think that Jesus was just a good man or a prophet, a good person, but they don't believe in his full divinity of who he was. But this says that Jesus came from God. He is God. He is eternal. It also says he is an agent of creation of all things. He was there with God in the beginning of the world, creating all things. It shows that Jesus was divine. He wasn't just a good man. He wasn't just a prophet, but he was God himself creating the world with the Father. He said, "Let there be light," and there was light. And just as he said there was light in the beginning of time, Jesus has now come to the world and has become the light of men. He's become the light that shines in the darkness and shows the truth of the Word of God and the truth of who God is, who Jesus is, to the world. He begins to show the truth of how to live a life with God. Adam and Eve's eyes were opened by the tree of knowledge of good and evil. They were open with the bad things of life. They were open with what was good, what was bad, but they weren't open to what the true life of God means that they had open to them. If they would have eaten through the tree of life, they would have saw what it means to live a life in God, living in the power of his Spirit, the truth that he has for us. Now, the chapter goes on to talk about John as a witness, John the Baptist. It sandwiches some parts of what it's talking about Christ and then goes on to John to talk about how he was a witness. And it says in verse 6, "There came a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify about the light so that all might believe through him. He was not the light, but he came to testify about the light. There was the true light which, coming into the world, enlightens every man. He was in the world, and the world was made through him, and the world did not know him. He came to his own, and those who were with his own did not receive him. But as many as received him, to them he gave the power to become children of God, even to those who believed on his name, who were born not of blood, nor the will of the flesh, nor the will of man, but of God." John continues to talk about the light as Jesus being the light to the world. He came to reveal who God is by becoming like him in the flesh. He came to open our eyes to the truth about God. And it says that we have become children of God. We have become like Christ. Christ, who is begotten of the Father, is a descendant from Father who is just like him, who became begotten in the flesh, so in that he is a child of God, has called us also to be begotten, to become children of God and heirs with the Father. And if we are his inheritance, we receive his gifts of God, his blessings that come from the Father to the children, like love, joy, peace, patience, goodness, kindness, gentleness, faithfulness, and self-control. The scripture goes on to say that the Word was made flesh. This is talking about how Jesus was made flesh. He became human as well as divine. And it shows the balance between the both and how Jesus lived his life. "And the Word became flesh," in verse 14, "and dwelt among us, and we saw his glory. Glory is the only begotten of the Father, full of grace and truth." John testified about him and cried out, saying, "This was he whom he said, 'He who comes after me has a higher rank than I, for he existed before me.' For of his fullness we have all received, and grace upon grace, for the law was given through Moses, grace and truth were realized through Jesus Christ. No one has seen God at any time. The only begotten of God, who is in the bosom of the Father, he has explained him." The life of God through Jesus Christ was revealed in his flesh. It says that he dwelt among us. He became just like us. He took on humanity to reveal how one lives the life of God in the flesh, how there can be both a supernatural element to our life, a spiritual element, and a physical element to our life. How there can be both. He came to demonstrate victory over sin and death through living a life in the flesh in the power of the Spirit of God. Now, there's a song that came out in the 90s that says, "What if God was one of us?" And I cry out every time I hear that song, and I say, he was one of us. He became just like one of us. He took on the flesh. He took on the limitations that come with living as a human. And he showed how to live the life of God through human flesh. In verse 18, it said, "No one has seen God at any time. The only begotten of God who is in the bosom of the Father explained him." Jesus came to reveal God. He came to explain who God was by living a spiritual life of God in the flesh. He became showed the image of God, of what God was like, not by what he looked like physically, but how his spiritual life was revealed through him living in a physical body. This came to show us how we can live our own life. In Genesis, it says that man was made in his own image, in God's image. If we are children of God, we are to be like him, his image. And Jesus was that image of God in human likeness, in human form. He came to show how we can live a life for God in the human flesh. How there can be a balance between divinity and humanity. We're not divine, but we can live a spiritual life and a human life at the same time. Just as Jesus lived a divine life and a human life, we're brought into his spirituality and can live a life in him. Jesus came to show how spiritual lives in the flesh, he's shining his light of truth of what it means to be both human and spiritual. Now we know that Jesus was a carpenter. And the question was, the things that I think about is when he was a carpenter and he had to sand down the boards and he had to make cuts and everything, did his hands actually get blisters? Did they get calloused? Or because he's the Son of God, that his hands were perfectly moisturized? Were they just in perfect form? Was he never sick and perfectly ever healed and perfect in every way, beyond not letting the humanness of this world touch him, but him being perfect? And I tend to think that somehow his life did show the evidence of the human life in him. He may have saw the wear and tear on his life. I mean, we think about near the end of his life when he was facing death, that he sweat blood. His body, he may have had in his spirit perfect peace and hope in God, but his physical body was taking a toll on what the tremendous task that was set before him, that even his flesh sweat blood. His flesh was feeling the impact of what was to come before him, even if in his spirit he was right and hopeful in God. His flesh took a toll on his life. So I tend to think maybe he did have blisters. And this is a conversation about theologians talk about all the time of how much God was human. Some believe he wasn't even human. The Gnostics believe in Gnosticism, which believes that everything is spirit, nothing is human. And Jesus was just a spirit in this world. He didn't really experience the human life. But we know that Jesus was both divine and human at the same time. He took on flesh. He had bones. He had the physical attributes of a man. He felt what it was like to live human, but he also lived a divine life. In Philippians it says, "Who existing in the form of God counted it not being on equality with God a thing to be grasped." He is saying that he even though he was God, he took on humanity. And he showed a way to become a servant of God in a way that he did not take advantage of the fact that he was divine when he lived a human life. He showed how in the limitations of living a human life, he could still live for God by the power of his Spirit. He could accept limitations, for where there is a disadvantage physically, there is an advantage spiritually by relying on the power of God in this flesh. Jesus did not take advantage of the fact that he was God, but fully took on humanity with all its limitations that it consisted of. Philippians goes on to say, but he emptied himself, taking on the form of a bondservant, being made in the likeness of men. Jesus became fully human and accepted the wear and tear that can happen to men, even the eventual death of his physical body. Even though his hands were of man, broken with the toils of life of a carpenter, filled with calluses, his broken hands can heal. And the theme of this message is that broken hands can heal. God can use brokenness of the human flesh and still reveal God through it. There was a time in the book of Kings where there was a man that was going to be buried, and they didn't have a place for him to be buried, so they buried him in Elisha's tomb. So when they opened up the grave and began to put the body down, when the body touched the bones of Elisha, he came back to life. He was raised from the dead. And this shows that even through brokenness, even death itself can bring healing to others. Broken hands can heal. Dead bones of the patriarchs still speak to us today through the book of the prophets, through the book of the law, through the book of Psalms and Proverbs. They give us hope to live our lives free from anxiety and to put our trust in God. David wrote some of the Psalms, and he was a murderer, adulterer, and God revealed how he can use the broken hands of David and bring life, how he can heal life. David still speaks to us today, or in Psalms 23, that the Lord is our shepherd, I shall not want. He talks about how we can trust in God in taking care of us in every area of our life. Even if we face through the valley of the shadow of death, we will fear no evil. That truth that was expounded thousands of years ago still comes to us today, and in our darkest hour gives us hope. Jacob's family was a mess. He was the younger son of Esau, but he was favored over Esau, and he took his birthright. He took the final blessing, the prayer that came from Isaac on to Jacob from Esau, who it was supposed to be given. He received the blessing. And with Laban, he helped get the better flock from Laban and stole from his the better flock from Laban and stole from his flock to get the better sheep. And his life was not right with Laban. He was a deceiver. And yet God came to him in a vision and showed again the promise that was given to Abraham, that he would have seeds like the sands of the seashore and the stars in the sky, that his descendants would be so large. And he gave this promise again that was given to Abraham down to Jacob. He showed that he could be used by God. And even in Jacob's brokenness, he could be used by God. God bring healing to his life and showed him that God was going to use him for his purposes. There was this movie that I watched a while ago called Fathers and Daughters. And in the beginning of this movie, this father, daughter, and mother were in a car accident, and the mother died. And it was about this father who had to raise his daughter without having the help of a mother. And it took a toll on the daughter. Her daughter's life was impacted greatly about the loss of life. And it wasn't long, this father was an author and he wrote books, and they weren't succeeding until he wrote this book called Fathers and Daughters, about how a father's living a life for his daughter without a mother. And as he turned his manuscript in, he ended up had a large seizure and he died. And this girl was left without family. And she grew up, and it took a toll on her life, and it showed her as a grown-up, and it showed how her personal life was a mess. It showed she was also a counselor. She graduated from school and became a counselor. And in her professional life, she was okay, but her personal life, she couldn't get it together. And she was counseling a young girl who wouldn't speak. She met with her months and months and months and not a word. Her supervisor eventually came to her and said, we're going to give this case to a more qualified professional. And so she went to break the news to this child and said, you know what, I can't have your case anymore. It's too difficult. I'm going to hand you off to someone who has more experience than myself. And the girl opened up her mouth and spoke and said no. She wanted this counselor to continue to work with her, and that girl began to speak. This counselor began to work with her, and she began to speak. And it keeps showing both sides of the story. She was able to help this young girl, but she couldn't help her own life. She couldn't get her life together with her personal relationships with others. She was living a sinful life. And somehow, through her brokenness, she was still able to minister life. God can use broken hands to heal. Now, this doesn't mean that she's validated and she's righteous with God. No, she needed to come to God. She needs to come to God and to know God to be the healer of her brokenness. And it begins to show how she begins to heal in the movie. But we don't see the full story. We need to see how God can come and even in our brokenness, bring us to him and use us to be blessing to others. There's a man named Brennan Manning. He's an author of books that speak on the grace of God. And he knows grace of God like some others don't, because he became an alcoholic after becoming a Christian. He found himself in a broken heart and an even more brokenness because he knew he was not living the life that God had called him to. But God delivered him and raised him up and began to give him, out of his brokenness, begin to speak words about how God can come even in the darkest hour and bring grace to our life and not waste our life, but redeem it again and restore a wrong relationship back to him. It's one thing to live a broken life and come to God and then live it to the fullest, to the end of a life. But that wasn't the case with him. He was embarrassed that he actually knew God and he didn't have excuse, and he became broken. But God healed him and restored him and showed how others can be healed and give hope even after living the darkest life. Normally, we like to hear a coming to Jesus moment that forever changes the life of a person, with an epilogue that their life was nothing but an effective witness and that have a happy ending. But that isn't always the case with our life. We face bumps in the road. We face hardships. We may turn our back on God, but God wants us to come and turn back to him. He wants us to come out of our brokenness and use that brokenness to heal. Through our brokenness, God speaks to us, giving his light in our life. God uses broken leaders. It says in the book of Proverbs in 21:1, the king's heart is like channels of water in the hand of the Lord. He turns it wherever he wishes. Now, I don't know if the president that we have is a Christian or not. I don't know if the new president-elect is a Christian in his real heart. But we know that there could be flaws in their life, but God can use them. It says that he can turn their heart whichever way he wishes. We know that God can use the broken for him. It doesn't take away personal responsibility, but it does show that God can use us. Even if we fail, he can use us. For consider your calling, brethren, that there were not many wise according to the flesh, not many mighty, not many noble, but God has chosen the foolish things of the world to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of the world to shame the things which are strong. 1 Corinthians 1:26-27. Each person must deal with their own brokenness in response to God by his grace. There are those who do the works of God just to bring attention to themselves, and this is a dangerous place to be with God. Many will say unto me on that day, Lord, Lord, did we not prophesy in your name, and in your name drive out many demons, and perform many miracles? Then I will tell them plainly, I never knew you. Away from me, you evildoers. Matthew 7:20-23. God will take care of those who only for the fame of men peddle the gospel. With wisdom we must judge, not because the broken can seem easy to judge when it is like the spiritual ones are the ones who are in real trouble. Do not look on the outward appearances. God uses broken hands to heal. In conclusion, we just want to remember that God became flesh and dwelt among us. He showed us the balance between humanity and divinity. And for us, the balance between humanity and living a spiritual life. He showed us how to live a life in God in the flesh. How with its limitations, we can be used by God to heal others. We can use our brokenness that we've walked through in this life to bring hope and healing to other people. God showed us through Jesus how to live a life in the flesh with its limitations to be used by God. So when we are at a disadvantage in the flesh, God shows we can be an advantage spiritually. Where we are weak, he has become strong. The Word became flesh and dwelt among us. God is both man and flesh, and he has showed us how to live the perfect life in the flesh towards God. May the Lord bless you and keep you. May he cause his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. May he lift up his countenance upon you and give you his peace. Go in the name of the Lord. Thank you.